Most people believe they already know this chapter. They recognize its tone, remember fragments of it, associate it with moments meant to feel beautiful and affirming. But 1 Corinthians 13 was not written to decorate love or to preserve an ideal version of it. It was written into a community where love was already failing under pressure, where proximity had begun to produce friction, and where people still believed they were doing well simply because they felt sincere. From the start, the chapter assumes that love has reached the stage where good intentions are no longer enough. What makes this text unsettling is that it never defines love as something that feels natural or rewarding. It describes love almost entirely through restraint, through what a person refuses to do when reaction would feel justified, patience where impatience would feel earned, kindness where withdrawal would feel safer, a refusal to keep record of irritation even when the irritation keeps returning. This is not the language of romance or enthusiasm. It is the language of endurance, written for people who are already tired, because love becomes difficult precisely at the point where it stops being abstract, when it has to operate inside repeated misunderstandings, unspoken disappointment, and the quiet accumulation of small injuries that come from staying close to another human being over time. This chapter speaks as if that closeness is already present, as if the strain has already begun, and as if the real question is no longer whether love exists, but whether it can remain without becoming defensive. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the way this chapter frames love because it does not offer relief. It does not suggest distance, space, or release. It does not validate the instinct to protect oneself by pulling away. Instead, it assumes that love will place you close enough to be affected by another person's limits, moods, and failures, and then quietly asks whether you will still choose restraint when reaction would feel more honest. This is why love begins to feel heavy long before anything collapses. Not because something dramatic has happened, but because love has entered the phase where it must be carried consciously, where words have to be filtered, where silence sometimes costs more than speaking, and speaking costs more than silence, where remaining present demands effort that no one else sees. And it is exactly here, before relationships break and before distance feels inevitable, that this chapter enters without softness and asks a question most people avoid sitting with for very long. Not whether love is real, but whether it can survive the cost of staying present when it would be easier not to. This chapter did not emerge from harmony. It was written into a community where closeness had already begun to fracture, where people shared the same space, the same language of faith, and yet found themselves increasingly unable to remain gentle with one another. Corinth was not lacking passion or conviction. It was overflowing with them. What it lacked was restraint. People spoke freely, corrected publicly, asserted themselves loudly, and believed that sincerity alone was proof of righteousness. Paul addresses a group convinced they were spiritually alive while slowly becoming relationally careless. They valued expression more than impact, truth more than timing, strength more than patience. The result was not open conflict, but something quieter and more corrosive. Conversations that left residue, gatherings that exhausted rather than restored, relationships that technically continued while something essential eroded underneath. This is why the chapter begins where it does. Not by praising love, but by stripping everything else of its assumed value, knowledge without patience, speech without care, conviction without kindness. Each of these still looks impressive from a distance, but up close they leave people diminished. Paul is not arguing that these things are wrong. He is exposing that they are insufficient when proximity becomes real and repetition unavoidable. Because the real test of love is not intensity, but duration, not how strongly something is felt, but how carefully it is carried over time. In Corinth, people had learned how to speak, lead, and display devotion, but had not learned how to stay gentle once familiarity set in. And familiarity is where love quietly becomes difficult. When habits replace novelty, when flaws stop being theoretical, when the same tensions return again without resolution. What Paul is naming is not a dramatic failure, but a slow one. The kind that happens when people remain together, but stop protecting each other internally. When words are still exchanged, but patience is no longer assumed. When being right feels more urgent than remaining kind. This is the moment love is most at risk, not because something exploded, but because nothing did. And it is into this exact condition that the chapter speaks, not offering a strategy to fix others, but redefining what it means to remain present without turning hard. Not because affection has disappeared, but because closeness now demands something more deliberate than feeling alone can sustain. This is where most people quietly misread the chapter. They hear the language of love and assume it is describing emotion, sincerity, or intensity. But 1 Corinthians 13 is doing something far more unsettling. It measures love not by what is felt, but by what is withheld, not by what is expressed, but by what is restrained. The chapter does not ask how deeply someone feels. It asks how consistently someone chooses not to react. Because love, as Paul describes it, is constantly placed in situations where reaction would feel justified. Patience only matters when impatience feels earned. Kindness only costs something when irritation has a reason. Love does not insist on its own way, only becomes difficult when there is a very clear sense of being right. This is not ideal love. This is love under pressure, measured in moments where self-control feels unnatural. What makes this uncomfortable is that the chapter removes all the places we normally hide. Passion is not enough. Conviction is not enough. Even sacrifice, without love, is described as hollow. The text exposes how easily people confuse strong expression with faithful presence, how quickly volume replaces care, how often being right becomes more important than remaining gentle. Pure love is not framed as generosity of feeling, but as discipline of response. It is not something that flows automatically. It has to be chosen again in situations that repeat, where the same tensions return, and the same people disappoint in familiar ways. This is where love becomes difficult, not in crisis, but in continuity. Not in one dramatic moment, but in the daily decision not to keep score. The chapter quietly insists that love reveals itself most clearly not in what someone does once, but in what they refuse to do repeatedly. It does not parade itself. It does not weaponize truth. It does not seek relief at the expense of relationship. This kind of love is demanding precisely because it removes the excuse of impulse. It assumes awareness. It assumes responsibility. It assumes proximity that lasts long enough for friction to form. And that is the tension this chapter places in front of anyone willing to read it honestly. Not whether they feel love, but whether they are prepared to let love interrupt their instinct to protect themselves, assert themselves, or withdraw when staying present would cost less pride but more patience. Corinth was not a gentle place to learn how to love. It was loud, competitive, fractured by status, success, and comparison. People gathered in the same spaces, spoke the same language of faith, used the same words, yet lived as if recognition mattered more than care. Everyone wanted to be seen. Everyone wanted to be right. Everyone wanted their role to matter more than the others. It is into this environment that the words of 1 Corinthians 13 are spoken, not as poetry meant to soften people, but as interruption. Paul does not begin by describing affection or warmth. He begins by dismantling the things people were already proud of: eloquence, knowledge, spiritual intensity, sacrifice, even faith itself. He lists everything that looks impressive from the outside, and then quietly removes its weight by saying it can all exist without love and still amount to nothing. This is unsettling, because it exposes a possibility most people avoid considering, that a life can be full of effort and still be empty of love, that someone can speak beautifully, believe sincerely, endure hardship, and still miss the one thing that gives meaning to all of it. Love is not introduced here as an emotion to be cultivated, but as a measure that reveals what effort is actually doing. The chapter does not ask whether love feels good. It asks whether love is present when it costs something, because in Corinth, love was easy to talk about and hard to practice. People gathered but divided, they served but compared, they believed but competed, and this tension is exactly why the chapter exists. Not to idealize love, but to redefine it as something that remains when recognition is removed. This is where the discomfort begins, because love, as described here, is not dramatic. It does not insist. It does not protect the ego. It absorbs slowness, misunderstanding, and imbalance without keeping score. And suddenly the question shifts from what we believe or accomplish to something far more personal. What happens inside us when love is no longer rewarded? What makes this moment so difficult to accept is that nothing in this description assumes reciprocity. Love is not framed as something balanced, negotiated, or evenly distributed. It is described as something that continues even when the weight is uneven, when one side carries more patience, more restraint, more silence than feels reasonable. The text never promises that love will be met with equal care. It only describes what love does when it is not. This is where many people quietly step back, because love is far easier to admire than to inhabit when it becomes asymmetrical, when effort is not matched, when understanding is not returned, when remaining gentle feels less like virtue and more like loss. Yet the chapter speaks as if this imbalance is not an exception, but an expected condition, as if love, by its very nature, will eventually place someone in the position of choosing whether to continue without guarantee. The verbs themselves give this away. bearing, believing, hoping, enduring. These are not passive states. They are forms of sustained action over time, chosen repeatedly in the absence of reinforcement. They describe movement without applause, commitment without clarity, presence without assurance that anything will change. Love is portrayed not as something that fixes situations, but as something that refuses to become hardened by them. And this is precisely where the chapter becomes unsettling rather than inspiring, because it removes the comforting idea that love exists to correct imbalance. Instead, it suggests that love reveals itself most clearly when imbalance remains, when there is no resolution, when fairness is delayed or never arrives, when the only visible outcome is that someone chose not to withdraw, not to retaliate, not to turn cold. This reframes love entirely. It is no longer the reward at the end of connection, but the cost of remaining connected when reward disappears. Not the feeling that draws people together, but the discipline that keeps someone present when leaving would feel justified. And once love is seen this way, the chapter stops sounding poetic and starts sounding demanding, not because it asks for more emotion, but because it asks for endurance without promise. This is the threshold where love stops being something people talk about and becomes something that quietly tests how much discomfort they are willing to carry without needing to be seen, validated, or repaid. At this point, the chapter stops sounding philosophical and starts interfering with ordinary life, because the kind of love being described cannot remain theoretical for long. It shows up in rooms, in conversations, in the way people handle small moments that never make it into memory. The tension becomes visible not in dramatic confrontations, but in gestures so ordinary they are easy to overlook. Someone speaks sharply, and another person chooses not to respond. A comment lands heavier than intended, and instead of correcting it publicly, it is absorbed. A mistake is noticed, but not announced. Credit is quietly withheld from the self and allowed to rest elsewhere. None of these moments look important on their own, but together, they reveal how love actually operates when it is no longer rewarded with recognition. This is where the conflict sharpens, because restraint always costs something. It costs the satisfaction of being seen as right. It costs the relief of releasing irritation. It costs the small, private pleasure of correcting someone who deserves it. Love, as described here, asks a person to carry that cost internally so that it does not spill outward and damage what is being protected. What makes this difficult is that these moments are invisible to everyone else. No one applauds the silence that could have become accusation. No one notices the patience that prevented embarrassment. No one marks the decision to remain kind when sharpness would have been justified. Love does not announce itself here. It simply absorbs pressure and moves on. And over time, this accumulation begins to matter, not because it fixes everything, but because it shapes the atmosphere people live inside. Relationships do not fracture as quickly. Trust is not eroded as easily. The space remains inhabitable, even when it is imperfect. Love does not remove tension. It prevents tension from becoming destructive. This is why the chapter insists on these qualities so relentlessly, not because they are admirable, but because without them, closeness eventually becomes unlivable. Without patience, familiarity turns cruel. Without kindness, honesty becomes weaponized. Without restraint, every relationship slowly trains people to protect themselves instead of each other. Here, love is no longer an ideal to aspire to. It becomes a daily practice of choosing what will not be released into the room, a discipline of deciding which impulses end with you. And once this is seen clearly, the chapter stops feeling distant. It becomes uncomfortably close, asking not what love should look like in theory, but what it is costing you quietly in places no one else sees. In Corinth, these words did not float in the air like philosophy. They landed in rooms, in gatherings where people were speaking over one another, correcting one another, performing devotion in public, and leaving with the quiet satisfaction of having been spiritual, while someone else left diminished. That is why Paul's description of love becomes so specific. It is not an ideal to admire. It is a standard that exposes what is happening between real bodies in real space. Picture the kind of meeting the letter assumes. A cramped home, oil lamps breathing smoke into the ceiling, voices rising, a few people eager to be heard, others shrinking back, food set out unevenly, some eating early, some arriving late and finding little left. Nothing here is explosive. It is worse than that. It is normal. It is the slow formation of a culture where impact is ignored because everyone is convinced their motives are pure. And into that normality, Paul drops the kind of line that sounds gentle until you realize what it demands. Love is not irritable or resentful. That is not a personality trait, it is a refusal. It means the moment you have the right to tighten, to keep score, to carry a private list of reasons why you are justified in pulling away, love interrupts you and asks for restraint anyway. This is where the chapter stops being inspirational and starts becoming invasive, because it implies that love is proved in the exact moments no one applauds. When you let a comment pass without storing it, when you choose timing over winning, when you refuse to turn a room into a stage, when you protect someone's dignity even while you feel overlooked. In a community like Corinth, that kind of love would have looked like weakness. Paul treats it as the only strength capable of keeping closeness from turning into corrosion. At some point, this description of love stops being something you can agree with in theory, and starts confronting you with a decision you cannot avoid. Because the kind of love being described here cannot be practiced accidentally. It only exists where someone notices their impulse and chooses against it. And that choice always comes with a cost. The cost is not dramatic. It is smaller and more persistent than that. It is the cost of letting something go unanswered, of allowing a misunderstanding to remain partially unresolved, of choosing not to defend your version of events, even when you are convinced it is accurate. Love here does not demand that you be wrong. It demands that you decide what matters more than being right. This is where the chapter quietly divides people, not between those who love and those who do not, but between those who want love to protect them and those who are willing to let love shape them. Because love, as described here, will not shield you from discomfort. It will place you inside it and ask whether you are willing to stay present without tightening. The choice is subtle but decisive. You can use distance as protection, slowly withdrawing so that nothing can reach you deeply enough to hurt again. Or you can remain close, accepting that closeness will continue to expose you to frustration, imbalance, and moments where restraint feels unfair. One option preserves control, the other preserves connection. This is not about tolerating harm or erasing boundaries. It is about recognizing the moment when reaction would feel satisfying but corrosive and choosing something quieter instead. Choosing not to turn irritation into identity. Choosing not to let a single moment harden your posture toward an entire relationship. Paul does not frame this as moral heroism. He frames it as necessity, because without this kind of restraint, closeness cannot survive over time. Familiarity will always produce friction. The only question is whether that friction will be allowed to reshape you into someone guarded, or someone capable of remaining open without being consumed. This is the choice the chapter places gently but firmly in front of anyone willing to read it honestly. Not whether love feels sincere, but whether you are willing to let love interrupt you, again and again, in moments no one else will ever see. What this chapter ultimately leaves behind is not instruction, but space. It does not tell you how to resolve what remains unresolved, nor does it promise that restraint will be rewarded in ways you can measure. It simply removes the illusion that love exists to make life easier, and places it instead where it actually operates. Inside proximity that continues, inside relationships that remain unfinished, inside days that repeat without offering clarity. By the end of the chapter, nothing dramatic has shifted on the surface. The same people remain, the same tensions exist, the same limits return. What has changed is quieter than that. The reader is left more aware of how much of life is shaped not by what is said or done once, but by what is consistently withheld over time, by the reactions that never leave the body, by the words that are filtered, by the moments where control is loosened just enough for something shared to survive. This does not feel like resolution, it feels like recognition. The recognition that love is not proven in moments of intensity, but in the long stretch where intensity fades and choice remains, where no one is watching, where nothing is recorded, where the only evidence is the continued possibility of staying present without becoming hard. The chapter ends without telling you whether this kind of love will succeed. It does not guarantee that patience will fix what is strained or that kindness will always be returned. It leaves you instead with a quieter question, one that lingers after the words stop. Not whether love is beautiful, but whether you are willing to keep choosing it in places where it feels invisible, costly, and unremarkable. And perhaps that is the final movement. Not an answer, but an opening. Not a conclusion, but a widening. An invitation to notice what you carry into the next conversation, the next silence, the next moment where reaction feels easier than restraint. The chapter does not follow you beyond that point. It simply steps back, leaving the space intact, and allows whatever comes next to be shaped by what you choose to hold or release quietly over time.